suppose as an opening salvo, since days are getting brighter, it is the day of love. Tell me something, Matt, that made you happy today.
Well, I don't know if it made me happy, but my partner was furious with me, just sort of apropos of nothing really, when she woke up, because she assumed without checking that I would have forgotten Valentine's Day, and she was sort of cross preemptively. And it turned out I actually am an excellent husband and had actually remembered Valentine's Day, was very well prepared, had hidden from her view lovely breakfast, flowers, champagne, wine of the same brand that we had at our wedding, and tickets to Alton Towers. So a moral victory. And after we finish recording this, we're going to have a lovely date night. So it's going to be very, very nice.
That sounds very sweet. That's so nice.
But it's also nice to be spending it with my my podcast boyfriend.
Yes. Well. As my girlfriend jokes, all of the middle-aged men that I work with are all my boyfriends. But do you know what? I recently said online, I think it was a prompt or something that was like, if you could like smell one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be? And like I said, there's a specific kind of smell in like Ireland. Like I grew up in rural Ireland, but it's like the last 2 weeks in February, first week in March, where it's like nature is blooming and like it's like the world is being reborn. It's just this indescribable smell of nature. But this morning, like I usually go outside when I wake up, so I wake up at like 6:45 every morning, and I go out and have a coffee out in the back garden in the building that I'm living in. And usually I have my headphones on, as people with ADD or ADHD will know, mornings aren't the best time. You're a little bit sluggish, but I usually wear like my headphones and just like listen to something to like pass the time. But this morning, I spotted a little robin in the tree that is in the garden next door.
Aww.
And I just took my headphones off and I, just listened to the bird songs and watched the robin for 5 minutes and drank my coffee until it flew away. And it really set me up for a really nice day. I'm not going to lie.
That's really lovely.
I do have a kind heart. I'm not all piss and vinegar, as some people might think. But Matt, also, since someone said it to me last week, and I forgot to intro the show last week, you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I am one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder.
Hello again. Yeah, I want to. We'll touch. We've set up some nice themes there about nature and about love and about piss and vinegar. I think we'll probably return to all of those in this episode and the coming up continuation of our series on the history of tattooing in Japan.
But before we get into that, just as a quick note, we have a live show at Brighton Tattoo Convention in 2 weeks' time. Or is that? No, it's next week. Next weekend on the 25th of February, we will be in the Sky Bar at 1 p.m. at lunchtime, so you can get yourself a bit of lunch and listen to us live. We're going to be talking about the history of tattoo conventions and a lot of other stuff. And also, if you don't already, make sure to check us out on Instagram. Like we said on last week's episode, we went to the Jesse Knight collection in Wales, and we've been posting a lot of really cool photos from that collection. But we're also posting a lot of interesting tattoo ephemera and other stuff, so make sure to check us out. It's Beneath the Skin Pod on Instagram. But yeah, let's get into the history of tattooing in Japan, part 2.
Part 2. So I think we might have said on the first series this was going to be 3 parts, but I executively decided it's going to be a 4-parter because I think there's so much to say, and as I said on the last episode, we're also only really covering this in absolute, quick podcasty surface detail. There's frustratingly not a huge amount of great material on these histories in English. There's more in Japanese. But again, go and pick up still the best book on this stuff. Irizumi by R.W. Van Gulik from 1982, which lays out, a good amount of the kind of basic structure of these stories. And all of them will have, much more in-depth rabbit holes to run down, even as we're covering it, over the course of 4 episodes. So, last episode we spoke pretty exclusively about indigenous tattooing in Japan, with a particular focus on the Ainu. There are some other indigenous traditions we didn't go into as much detail on, but we were talking about Japanese tattooing or tattooing in Japan that isn't quite of the kind that we might imagine when we use that phrase, Japanese tattooing today. What I want to start to do now is actually talk about the origins of what we think of as Japanese tattooing today. That kind of, the dragons and the chrysanthemums and the cherry blossoms and the back pieces and all of that stuff.
And yes, so when we left off last episode, we kind of ended on the point of Japan becoming a unified country. So what we're seeing now is that various different, regions within Japan are now becoming what we would consider a country, and what we're going into is what's traditionally called the Edo period. Isn't that correct, Matt?
More or less. I mean, so we some of our discussion last week had a kind of historical crossover with what we're going to be talking about today. Because Japan, as we also mentioned last episode, was essentially closed off to the outside world for about 250 years, from about 1600. Japan had been not a modern nation state in the conventional sense. It was a kind of group. It was constantly a kind of civil war, varying kind of warlords and feudal lords fighting over different bits of territories over centuries. As European expansion began with the era of, the Age of Sail and the era of colonialism, basically Christians started showing up.
Largely the Christians.
From the Christians. I think we mentioned this a bit last week as well. Largely from Portugal and Holland. And the feudal lords in Japan, again, I'm really simplifying this story, but the feudal lords in Japan basically just didn't want Japan to be Christianized. And so they basically banned Japanese people from leaving Japan, and they banned foreigners from coming to Japan. Other than a very, very small, very constrained bit of interaction at the port of Nagasaki, which is where Chinese and Dutch eventually merchants were able to trade, but they weren't allowed to travel in the interior of the country, etc. So what that created was this country that was really out of the view of the rest of the world, more or less, for a very, very long time, and for a very particular set of practices to kind of grow up quite undisturbed. I was visiting some friends at the weekend, and I was reminding them of this amazing fact, which just sort of illustrates how weird this history is. Given the temporality of the 3 prongs of this story, this would have been possible. A samurai could have sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, when you sent this to me, it prompted me to go straight to Wikipedia to verify this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in a practical sense, it couldn't have happened. But in terms of the time periods involved, the samurai existed way later than I think we imagine. And the fax machine, or the technology that underpins fax machines, was invented way earlier than you might imagine. And they cross over in the around about the middle of the 1800s. So this is the Japan is a weird country out of time from between 1600 to about 1855 or so. So let's really rewind again to sort of talk a little bit about some of the older histories of the more the mainstream Japanese population, rather than the indigenous Ainu that we talked about last week. The first records we have of tattooing in Japan that aren't indigenous are essentially from Chinese accounts that discuss punishment tattooing. Basically, tattooing used as a way of either stigmatizing a criminal, to as a deterrent in some respects, but also to allow people in the community to see that punishments had been carried out. In Japanese, you basically have these 2 words that are kind of interchangeable, more or less. One is irezumi, Again, apologies to anyone listening who speaks Japanese, because I do not. But irizumi basically means to put in, to bring in, to insert, and zumi or sumi meaning ink, so inserting ink. And the other one is hori mono. Hori, which you hear a lot in the names of tattoo artists, means to engrave, puncture, or incise. And mono means object or thing. So we have irizumi, inserting ink, and we have horimono, engraving objects, engraving things. Actually, they become pretty equivalent in modern Japanese discourse, but actually early on, in the kind of second half of the 17th century, for example, irizumi only refers to the punishment tattooing of criminals, whereas horimono was the term used for the representational figurative tattooing, as Gulick says, on the basis of free will and the choice of the tattooed individual.
And just a quick question: what sort of punishments would warrant the punishment, or what sort of crimes would warrant the punishment tattooing?
Yeah, well, in ancient China, they actually had a whole list of what ended up being called in Chinese ink crimes. So a list of specific crimes that were punishable by having a mark largely put onto your face for the worst crimes. So we have, for example, again quoting from Gulick, irizumi was applied for relatively mild offences such as flattery with ulterior motives.
Every man in a bar in Clapham at the weekend and this weekend will be getting an irizumi for that.
An irizumi. Fraud and extortion, dealing in flawed goods, etc. So that was first conviction, irizumi. Second conviction, death.
I mean, look, it's funny because I saw that video that was Politics Joe did, where they were interviewing people in the most pro-Brexit town in the UK, asking people about the death penalty, and a guy was saying, oh, why should prisoners have dentists? I don't have a dentist. They should be hung up or shot. And so with these punishment tattoos, is there a specific kind of set of iconography that's being tattooed, or is it just like you are being tattooed thief on your forehead?
Not quite. So it does vary a bit over time and from region to region. But the earliest ones are facial tattoos, marks, like wide stripes, either on the arm, the upper arm, and sometimes on the face. Later on, we start getting evidence of, like, so from 1670 in Edo, the tattooing consisted of the character Aku, which means bad, on your forehead. Right? You're a bad person. There's actually photographs. There's actually drawings which people can find online of some of these facial tattoos, some of these marks, and how they change over time. This really, one of the interesting sociological ideas about this is also something that you find in discussions of punishment tattooing that was happening in ancient Greece, and I talk a bit about this in the book, that where tattooing was imposed as a punishment, as a response to that, a kind of subcultural practice of tattooing developed to kind of cover up or embellish the criminal marks, right? And there's some theories about some of the development and changes of indigenous tattooing in the empires bordering ancient Greece, that where criminals, were stigmatized, their response was to kind of go home and embellish them and change them, and that led to a development of tattooing style. You can imagine that, right? Like if you've got kind of bad guy tattooed on your forehead or a big stripe on your arm, you might then use the same technology of tattooing to kind of cover it up. It might not work.
Yeah, I've seen some bad cover-ups, in the past, and I can't imagine that rudimentary cover-up tattoos in the 17th century are that much better.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, these also come, of course, like the very idea of punishment tattooing implies that you can, it's a bit glib in a way, right? Thinking about, you get marked with a tattoo to show that you were a criminal. But of course, to get a tattoo like that, you also have to be, it's pretty brutal. You have to be held down. You have to be captured. A lot of these tattoos also were linked punishments like forced labor or penal servitude of various kinds. So yeah, we end up, you end up with this pretty kind of brutal system. And in fact, again, the earliest records we have of these are as early as like 400 AD, really, really early, going right the way up until the Edo period in the 18th century. So there's sort of over 1,000 years of this practice. And, over time, and this happens in China in parallel, various benevolent rulers sort of change the rules, change what is and isn't punishable, etc. But you can see how, against those cultural backgrounds where tattooing has been used as a kind of punishment, why already there's this kind of stigmatization. And of course, those stigmatizations also then play into some of the stuff we talked about last week with the Ainu, because if you then become tattooed, there's a sense that being tattooed is kind of primitive. So there's a kind of dehumanization happening. And also, like, getting tattooed forcibly against your will and change and marring the body is also something that's quite spiritually and sort of theologically complicated in Buddhism. So Buddhism, which often prioritizes physical wholeness, really it has a kind of corporeal element to it. Taking someone's control of their body away, marring it, has an extra layer of, kind of existential horror than it might do in a different culture, against a different cultural context, right?
And just looking at, illustrated depictions of how these tattoos were applied, the one that I'm looking at right now is that it's 2 posts with a board nailed to the front, and your arms are bound to 2 posts and you're being pressed against the board, but also there's a rope around your neck to hold your head in place.
Yeah, I mean, imagine trying to tattoo someone's face without their permission, really. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we have to then figure out how we get from that very deep history of punishment tattooing to something a bit more modern. And the earliest kind of examples we have of free will tattoo, people choosing to be tattooed, other than, I guess, criminals covering things up or changing them to some degree, is a really beautiful little practice, which is, again, nice for Valentine's Day, which is called Irebokuro, which is basically a loyalty tattooing practice. So we have like mentions of this as early as the 17th century, so about 1600 or so. And it's essentially a dot tattooed on the inside of your thumb and finger, like where you're on the upside of your hand where it meets. And essentially, you and a lover or you and a close confidant would both have dots. And you can imagine if you're holding hands, your dots, you touch your partner's dots, right? So it's this kind of intimate love bond. And Irebokuro means literally like putting on of a mole, like putting on of a skin mole. And yeah, these match up when you're holding each other's hands. So this also is something that becomes also part of sex work culture, which we'll come back to in a second. But yeah, it's this really nice early kind of relationship between tattooing and intimacy, tattooing also, and very culturally specific ideas of love and interrelationship, right?
And I think that it's very congruent with culture right now, and that a lot of people get tattoos to signify their bond with someone, be it love or familial, and some things don't really change. I wonder if there was someone in that period trying to desperately like cover up the dot that lined up with someone else's dot because they broke up.
Maybe. I mean, I think, Gulick overdetermines this quite a lot. He's sort of like, well, loyalty is very important in Japanese culture. But of course, loyalty is important in every culture. And we find tattooing used to signify emotional bond and physical bonds all over the place in the West as well. We got to be careful, with overdetermining this stuff.
Yeah, we don't want to fall into the trap of Orientalism.
No, no, and of course, as I said, Gulick is writing this in 1982, so again, has a particular take on this. But I really like this idea of the kind of, this vow tattoo. There's also this general practice again of changing your body as a pledge of allegiance. So again, in the pleasure quarter, so Edo, which is what Tokyo was called when it was founded, had a part of the city that was sort of devoted to what was called amusements. One of the side effects of Japan being closed off to the world for so long is that and also being a feudal, basically military dictatorship. That's really what the Tokugawa shogunate was. What a shogunate is, it's a military dictatorship, basically a military feudal system. Is you have all these men in particular trained for war and no one to fight. Because you're literally hived off. Also, the class system in Japan is different in structure to the class system in Europe, or certainly was. I mean, we have basically 4 classes, and they're quite differently oriented because of Confucianism. So there's less of a connection between social class and wealth. So samurai were pretty high up, but like peasants who farmed the land, who were very important, had a higher social status than rich artists and merchants. Because you were basically doing stuff that wasn't socially useful. And so in the kind of caste system, in the class system of ancient Japan, you could be rich but lower class, essentially. I'm going to simplifying this quite a lot.
Yeah, so, and just for anyone that's interested, the Shinokosho, or 4 divisions of society, being composed of the Shi, which is warriors, the No, which is farming peasants, the Ko being craftsmen and artisans, and the Sho being the merchant class.
Yeah, exactly. So what that means is you have a kind of interesting situation where the people with quite a lot of money and quite a lot of nice stuff, even there was a bit of, as I said, importation coming of stuff from abroad, but a really huge development of arts because there was not anything coming in to the country, or not much coming into the country, and also no one to fight, so people had time. And that a lot of Japanese art and craft develops over the course of the 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries because everyone has time. And what that means is that these amusement courses spread up to basically kind of allow samurai to pass the time. And a big part of that is sex and sex work, right?
Okay.
Now, again, prostitution. There's whole books about this. It's very complicated. A lot of it is obviously romanticized. We do have many stories of, basically again, sort of sex slavery essentially for women, but and men actually, but. There are, again, even within the kind of courtesan geisha classes, there are higher end courtesans, and the relationship of sex and commercialism in Japan is, again, a complicated subject we haven't got a lot of time to go into here. But these kind of physical loyalty things, as represented by these vow tattoos, also relate to potentially the way that sex working women would show their allegiance or their loyalty to their basically kind of brothel owner, or even to their clients. So she could demonstrate her loyalty by, quote, cutting off a finger or finger joint, tearing out a fingernail, branding with cinders of a pipe, or partial or complete cutting off of her hair. So this was a kind of way of showing a bond between a courtesan, between a sex worker and her lover. And within that context, this idea of using your body to indicate a vow, indicate a connection, is something that makes quite a lot of sense.
Yeah, once again, it's we have that continuation of history both in Asia and almost everywhere else of the mortification of the flesh.
Yeah, exactly. And this becomes in itself a kind of bit of a romantic set of stories. I love these. So around this time, and again, I'll circle back to this a little bit, but basically, because of this period of basically peace and isolation, art and literature are really flourishing, and tattooing becomes kind of a big part of the storytelling and of the popular imagination and of the art, as we'll talk about. So again, there's a lot of poetry. A few here again from Gulick, like talk about this particular practice, these vow tattoos. So in one, a pleasure quarter guest is mentioned as by a sex working woman who's in this poem. A pleasure quarter guest with whom I had exchanged vows of eternal love, and his name was tattooed on a hidden part of my arm. And then we have these kind of haiku poems. On the beautiful body, tattooed mottos by a bunch of needles. With tattooing, it all begins. Impiety to one's parents. In deep blue, the courtesan tattoos her falsehood. Unbecoming is the hidden inscription on the warrior's bow hand.
Incredible.
Right? Isn't that great? Tattooing becomes the bond to draw money. The mother's name on the father's arm is shriveling. Inscribed tattoos, when they grow old, it is shameful. On the courtesan's arm, popular names are pierced in.
And, you know, when we're talking about this, it is kind of important to recognize the influence of Neo-Confucianism in Japan during this period.
Right.
That, like, the arts and, like, particularly like poetry, like there is quite a lot of poetry written just by like regular people, because Neo-Confucianism in Japan at this period placed a heavy emphasis on intellectualism and the arts and expression and kind of the understanding of the world through both artistic expression but like rational reasoning as well. So it kind of this helped fuel this artistic movement at the time of, you know, samurais writing poems.
Yeah, but that's sort of also a backlash, right? So the social system was very patriarchal, obviously. Marriages would be arranged because of this strict class system. And so actually, if you wanted real romantic love, if you wanted romantic relationship, bizarrely, you'd go and see sex workers because, you know, courtesans, geishas, because it was in the amusement quarters, in the pleasure quarters, that you could actually live a kind of authentic loved life away from the strictures of religion, you know. And again, I think that's really interesting. There's a kind of, in a Western context, you know, the association between tattooing and sex work is also imagined, and I've talked about this in my book, and it's this thing that's meant to be a bit shameful. But in a Japanese context, with a particular context of the social context, that sex worker tattooing or tattooing on samurais and their lovers is something that's actually quite a bit more recognizably kind of profound and authentic than I think that vague description of samurais and the sex workers they were living with leaves to understand, at least in the popular imagination, you know?
Yeah, and it's something that we'll come back to in the 4th episode when we talk about the movement of Orientalism in the 20th century, that, you know, there is this kind of wave of popular cultural artifacts around particularly Japanese sex workers after the war, and like how that kind of permeates the popular consciousness during the 20th century. But we'll get back to that in the 4th episode. Exactly.
So all right, so we've got this kind of sense then that tattooing is something that by the 1700s is something that is, you know, it's kind of a youth culture in a way. It's kind of a subculture in a way. It has all this particular resonance. It has all these taboos already built into it. What we think of as Japanese tattooing today, the big dragons and scenes from woodblock prints and stuff, really isn't very old, therefore, by historical standards. I think, you know, a lot of the orientalizing that happens of Japanese tattooing and Japanese culture in general, like, really imagines it as this ancient practice. And we talked last episode about what really ancient Japanese tattooing actually looks like. The modern Japanese tattooing is really only, you know, from 1750. So what's that, like 250, 260 years old, something like that. It's not that old. And certainly by the time it was revealed to the West for the first time, it was only really 100 years old. It wasn't that old at all. You know, as long ago from the present as like World War I was. So it hasn't got this inherently ancient form to it. It's quite modern in a particularly kind of Japanese way.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information. And, funnily enough, this sort of idea becomes increasingly relevant as we move, into the future when we're looking at, say, the 20th century. And we will talk more about it in a future episode. But as I'm reading The Tattoo Murder by Akimitsu Tagagi, there is a fantastic line in the book that jumped out at me when we were knowing we were going to have this conversation today. And it's a character having a conversation with another character at a tattoo competition, pretty much. And there's
in the 1940s.
Yeah, in 1947, around about. So American GIs are strutting around with their tattoos, and this character who speaks to the protagonist is essentially talking down on the American GIs. Have you seen the ridiculous Americans strutting around showing off their pathetic sushi tattoos? He pointed towards a small clump of GIs who were chatting with two young Japanese women in identical short dresses. He goes on to say, unlike the Japanese tattoo, which flows over the contours of the body like a river over stones, the Americans cover their arms with a hodgepodge of unsightly obvious designs, hearts, anchors, flags, and the like. I suppose an upstart country like the United States doesn't have any folklore or tradition to draw upon, but still, there is no excuse for the total lack of artistry, no imagination, and the shading techniques are appallingly primitive, like something from the Stone Age. The subtle shadowing that sets the Japanese tattoo apart is achieved by the use of natural pigments which are applied with immeasurable skill by a true artist, manipulating a variety of needles, with each bundle of needles encased in a wood handle. But the Americans, they use a single needle, which is why their designs are as thin as a bowl of milk that's been left out in the rain. And it's funny we're talking about that in the context of, the 16th, 17th century, and what we think of as contemporary Japanese traditional tattooing not being that old, that the cultural idea of what traditional Japanese tattooing is becomes so solidified so quickly, and then becomes, in terms of the monoculture, seen as this ancient art that has existed forever.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And actually, we have Japanese tattoo. I was just looking up what was invented in around the same time. So Japanese tattooing is about as old as the fire extinguisher.
Okay.
Japanese tattooing is about as old as the sextant. Japanese tattooing is about as old as the spinning jenny. The spinning wheel. It's actually younger than the steam engine.
Oh.
Roughly, when we're talking 1750, it's not like January the 1st, 1750, some guy invented tattooing. It's not quite like that. But this is what we're talking about, right? This is the history. I think because Japan, as I said, feels out of time, you can really think about it as this kind of, completely ancient practice. And actually, tattooing in Japan of the modern kind is really developing at the same time as the Industrial Revolution's beginning in Europe.
Yeah, and I think if anyone thinks we're maybe being a bit glib about it, I think this is, the purpose of this show is to just talk about tattoo history, but also kind of dispel a lot of myths about it as well, which is, why we're talking about this.
And now, that said, right, about its ancientness. That said, the stories and the iconography and the mythology, of course, is much older than that. The biggest influence on the development of modern Japanese tattooing, let's call it that, is a Chinese book or kind of novel, I guess is the best way to describe it, which is called The Water Margin, also called occasionally Outlaws of the Marsh. It's like with all very old novels, it's very difficult to it will have gone through several variants in different printings, and but essentially it's set in like the 12th century in China, and it dates from somewhere around the 14th, early 14th to maybe as late as the 16th century. So it's traditionally attributed to this author called Shi Naian, who lived between 1296 and 1372, but it wasn't actually referenced anywhere, as far as we can tell, until like the early decades of the 16th century. Anyway, it is basically a story of like folk lore, really. It's 108 spirits, 108 kind of ghosts, and the themes and stories about what happens when these monsters and these spirits are released. We have in it, all these themes of again that become very, very prevalent in Japanese literature and visual culture. Like it's very funny. It has lots of relationships with nature. A lot of it is to do with like masculinity and these kind of hero warriors involved who are overcoming various hero's journey kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, it becomes in Japan really, really, really popular in basically this period in the 18th century. It's kind of comic book. It's folk lore. It is this huge kind of cultural phenomenon, right? In Japanese, it gets called the suikoden, and it becomes like everyone's reading it. Everyone's kind of engaging with it. Everyone's learning about it. And it then also spawns loads of imitators, loads of other stories, loads of other similar things. And because of its popularity, it also spurs on the development of mass printing techniques because everyone wants to read this. We love the
printing press. We love the printing press on this show.
Yeah, well, we're not talking about the printing press. It's all still hand printed, but it is mass production woodblock printing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like it at this time, and again, people that kind of maybe have a visual imaginary of thinking about artists like Hokusai, who are working around about this time a little bit later on. These techniques are different.
I heard that great wave coming from a mile away.
Yeah. So this is basically a period of Japanese history which gets called a Japanese art which is called ukiyo-e, right? The floating world, because from the like kind of late 18th century, it's a period where these arts have reached maturity and there's even less conflict and even less worry in the world and even more basically time to sit and have so much joy.
Mm-hmm.
So these woodblock prints, these very early ones, basically also begin to be taken up by tattooing, right? Because they're super fashionable. And I've talked about before in loads of other places that tattooing reflects the visual culture from which it emerges. And, you know, these images of these heroes and these ghosts and these monsters and these legends, basically people want to kind of associate themselves with them, basically.
And it's very interesting as well in the context of the art history of Japan that you, within this 150-year period, you see the development of multiple different art forms, all kind of reinterpreting and expressing a lot of the same folk tales or kind of stories. So you have the development of what would be considered contemporary geisha performance, woodblock prints, tattoos, also poetry, music, and it's all kind of happening in this period all together, relatively.
Yeah, and what happens is really, as I sort of alluded to it earlier on, like this becomes a good way to cover up your punishment tattoos, basically. So the first people who are really taking this up are like, you know, kind of vagabonds in a way. These kind of, they also get called kind of, you know, street knights, like these guys that were kind of, you know, a bit rough, a bit ready, sometimes, you know, basically kind of highwaymen. Basically these men who were at the edges of society but still involved in art and pleasure, because those two things are connected in a different way in Japan to they would be in Europe. It then basically becomes a bit more of a general fashion. So it starts becoming taken up by more everyday people, and particularly finds trendiness, I suppose, amongst, first of all, you know, what are called planakin carriers, basically male men, guys who were, like basically moving, you know, taking things around, delivering things. And who were also working as like taxi drivers, essentially, who were like carrying people around on their backs. Then we end up with firemen. And I want to talk a bit more specifically about firemen because, again, they become a real staple for a long time of tattooing culture. In Edo, it is the firemen who are, I guess, probably the most famous. There actually are quite a few contemporaneous woodblock prints showing groups of firemen with these big tattoos. And yeah, obviously, like firemen. So, as an aside, again, here's the general history on the tattoo history bit. Edo and Japan in general burnt to the ground a lot. Most houses were built of wood and paper, and Japan is beset by earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. Lighting was obviously done with like lamps, and so there were just fires everywhere all the time. Lots of pictures of Edo era city, Edo period, you know, not just Edo but other cities in Japan have, like, you can see in the drawings big buckets of water on the roofs, because that was basically this kind of firefighting system. So firemen are really important, and firefighting, as today but certainly back then, is a really dangerous job. And therefore, like all dangerous jobs, comes with a lot of superstition, comes with a lot of totemism, and comes with a lot of bravado and masculinity. And of course, like tattooing, again, as we see it all over the place, lends itself to all of those things, right? It's something that, because it hurts to get and is painful, comes with a kind of, you know, macho component. It also lends itself to superstition and magic thinking. And yeah, so the story goes with firemen that the tattooing is a way of, like, you know, maybe even saving them from being burnt to death. And a lot of obviously a lot of the designs that will be familiar with, Tom, are like, you know, carp and water. So a lot of that is coming from, this idea that having water on me is going to save me. In fact, firemen wore these, because, you know, didn't have like contemporary firefighting gear, they'd wear these cloaks and these coats that you then soak them with water before you went into the fire.
Mm-hmm.
And those coats themselves were often painted with designs on the inside, as a kind of decoration, and also as a sort of quasi-magical way of protection.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to read. There's again a whole sort of section here in Gulick, and I want to quote him specifically here because he talks about dragons, dragon tattooing, and also carp and water. But he says here, quote, the opposition between the elements of fire and water brings us back to the situation of tattooed firemen. Tattooed with a dragon, featuring such evident water associate characteristics, these kind of serpent-y kind of characteristics that make it almost look like a water creature.
Mm-hmm.
It would seem that fireman felt himself protected in his confrontation with the oppositional element fire. Such obvious concepts of protection by opposing elements are similarly revealed in the practice of providing roof edge tiles with the name of a river deity. And you can see this in architectural designs as well, right? You put a dragon on your roof to stop it burning, to stop your house burning down.
Mm-hmm.
These designs then, right, over the course of the sort of 100 or so years, become a way of developing it looks cool, it's badass, but it's also a way of showing your attitude. Even if you don't believe literally it's going to stop you burning to death, you can kind of embody yourself. We were talking the other day, you and I, about the Black Panther tattoo, the very famous Crawling Panther tattoo, and a lot of stereotypical tattoos in the Western context are symbols of ferocity and bravery and masculinity. Even in some of the earliest tattoos we've ever discovered in ancient Egypt from 5,000 years ago are of like fearsome animals like bulls. There's something about this kind of it's like wearing one of those cool Howling Wolf shirts, right?
Yeah. I think in the context of why, maybe to get a bit philosophical about it, I think it is a recognition that like maybe as humans we are at odds with the natural world in terms of like our power over it, until obviously the development of modern technology, and that these animals exist in symbiosis and in harmony with it, and that it's an attempt to adorn ourselves with symbols of these animals that seem to have power over nature and seem to exist without harm in nature.
Yeah, exactly, right. And those are very obvious and basic symbols which have quite clear folk art resonance, that then also have important mythological and spiritual associations in various religions as well, right? So yeah, absolutely. I don't want to go in here into every single possible design, but there's a lot of that kind of thing happening. I think we need to be careful about saying this tattoo means this or this tattoo means that, but there is this kind of association between imagery and meaning in quite a straightforward way. Few other things that became popular, not just amongst firemen, were things like a spider web on the back, playing cards on your body with the ace on your foot. Good gambler's tattoo. You'd hide the ace as if you were cheating under your foot. A figure of a god of good fortune on your shoulder blade. Which you could then move your shoulder to make him laugh or frown. And even kind of comedy tattoos. So basically, Gulick describes a polka-dotted hand towel tattooed over one shoulder with one end hanging down the back of the body. On the right buttock, a cat was tattooed with one uplifted paw. When the tattooed person walked, the cat was set in motion trying to catch the towel.
But you know what? I love that, because I think for people who are interested in tattooing, I think a lot of the time we can see traditional Japanese tattooing as this very serious, bit po-faced art form.
Yeah.
And like the fact that like it's funny, like people are getting funny tattoos, they're getting like stupid, dumb tattoos as well, just shows that once again, as we're talked about in the last episode, this episode, and subsequent episodes, it's much more complex and much more varying than we would think.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a really good point, and exactly the point I wanted to make there, right? That we do have this sense that it's very serious, and of course it is serious in so many ways, but it does come with comes with funniness. It comes with humor. It comes with little jokes like hiding the ace on your foot. It comes with sexiness. So there are good stories of tattooed women in the pleasure quarters, basically being performing tattooed women. There's one woman is described in a particular early 19th century bonsai period text as tattooed with all sorts of designs, including a water monster on her thigh, pointing towards the Jade Gate, which is a good it's a good euphemism. That naturally, the tattooed women attracted a large crowd that flocked together to witness the amusing sight. The women collected money for payments, and this became a bit of a show. There were, even at this point, tattoo. We're going to talk at the convention about tattoo conventions, but competitions even began. In fact, we'll talk more about tattoo competitions when we talk with Pascal about the book that you're reading, but they begin quite early, about 1830 or so. And yeah, tattooing is part of it's not just this very serious spiritual practice. It's also part of sex and joy and competition and commerce as well. Looking at the time, I think the last thing I want to mention here before we'll talk next episode about the tattooing that was happening at the time of the Meiji Restoration when the Americans arrived in 1858. But the other important part of this first period of the story is alongside mailmen, palanquin carriers, and firemen is actors, right? Basically celebrities. So a lot of woodblock printing was not meant to be fine art. These things are displayed in museums now, both in Japan and in Europe, as pieces of fine art. But a lot of it was just popular culture. I mean, I say just popular culture, was popular culture. They were relatively mass produced because woodblock printing allowed editions to be made, and they would reflect, famous actors, famous courtesans, famous members of the courts. They would also be, there's a whole side story here about shunga and basically pornography, kind of sexualized erotic imagery.
And as well, the massive amount of woodblock prints that are just mundane kind of everyday life as well.
Yeah, I mean, they were used for news, doing news stories and talking about the various events that were happening. So basically, actors, again, sort of like elsewhere in the world, sort of at the edges of society, living and working and experiencing life in the pleasure quarters, in the amusement quarters, began to be tattooed as well. And because they were celebrities, because they were famous in plays and theatre, wrestlers also come as part of this too. They were reproduced in woodblock prints, and their tattoos were depicted in those prints of the plays they were in, or even as kind of, almost like as pin-ups, I guess we'd say. And that, again, then sort of starts to push tattooing into a more kind of fashionable, widespread. I mean, it's not ever a mainstream. Don't get me wrong, it's not ever a mainstream thing, but it does sort of become, kind of trendy and kind of part of celebrity culture. So we end up with this interesting layering, right? So these heroes from the water margins, the Surikoden heroes, become tattoo designs, and then those tattoo designs are tattooed on actors, and then those actors are represented themselves in woodblock prints. So you end up with these really interesting layers of design. And it became basically so kind of conventional for actors to be tattooed that on occasion, tattooed actors would wear kind of, body stockings to show that they were more tattooed than they actually were. Faking it basically as part of their costume.
It's like a modern, the fake stick-on tattoos that you would get as a kid and you'd put on your arms and you'd think, oh, I'm so tattooed.
Yeah, and actually something that Gulick also points out is that in the earlier periods you could get away with painting tattoos on because stages were only lit by candlelight. When electric and more kind of proper lighting came in, you couldn't get away with having fake tattoos anymore. You had to get real ones.
See, photoshopping your pictures on Instagram isn't a modern problem.
Yeah. Exactly, right? That's the kind of, I guess, modern equivalent of that. All of this, we're talking more about banning and social prohibitions on tattooing, because they really do kick in properly in the 1860s for reasons that we again alluded to last episode. But the first real prohibition that we know about of tattooing comes from 1811. So, really society had gotten pretty decadent. And there was a sense as well that things needed to change. So this guy called Matsudaira Sadanobu, who was a reformer, basically, he was like, everyone needs to calm down, right? we don't want people wearing showy clothing, but actually the rules that said you can't wear showy clothing just meant that people had really showy linings to their clothes.
Okay.
So then they banned that, and that also then encouraged people to get tattooed, because if you couldn't have fancy clothes, you'd get fancy tattoos.
Mm-hmm.
So then this rule had to come in to try and forbid tattooing. So this is from 1811. Recently, carefree individuals have been propagating tattooing. They tattoo all sorts of pictures or characters on their whole body. They apply tattooing in black ink and colours. It should be noted, therefore, this custom, and particularly the way that unblemished body is defiled, must certainly be called a scandal. Nevertheless, young people consider it fashionable and do not mind being mocked or laughed at by everyone behind their backs. Recently, a number of people who are to be seen who've had themselves tattooed, once they've started on this deplorable practice, it will even extend to the hands and feet, eventually covering the entire body. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, even though the people who have themselves tattooed are of the opinion that others may perhaps approve, the decision has been taken after mature consideration to censor this highly improper behaviour that people freely tattoo themselves without any aversion. It is therefore forbidden as of this moment. Pass this order on. But like all these other rules, it was completely ignored, right? So it didn't actually have any effects. Firemen were still getting tattooed. The kind of rickshaw carriers, the palanquin carriers were getting tattooed. Mm. Even before Meiji, some things were getting a bit looser, and some visitors that arrived did describe seeing tattooed people. So you can see, even in that, and this is, I think, is going to come back to something you mentioned a minute ago. We have this idea, I think, of the banning of tattooing in Japan as to do with indigeneity and criminality, which it is to do with that in part. We also imagine it as this, as you said, very kind of deep and spiritual practice, which it is. But at the same time, it's also just kids getting cool tattoos to piss off their parents.
Some things never change. Some things never change.
In Confucianism, that has a particular, again, that's partly where that stuff about the vow tattooing comes in, about breaking away from your parents. Like your body belongs to your parents in some senses, and then you can kind of claim autonomy over it. But that's something which cool, hip Japanese kids have in common with cool, hip kids, everywhere. Children, adolescents, carefree people, as they're described in that translation, are just doing things that are countercultural and fun and joyous and likely to annoy their parents, because their parents are like, what do you look like? You look ridiculous, you idiots.
Yeah, right? So some things don't change.
So that's probably a good place to leave this episode, because in the next episode on this, we will talk about really the big names. We'll talk about some specific artists like Gonta and Horiyuno. We'll talk about how that tattooing is then viewed and appreciated and understood by Western visitors, and how then Japanese tattooing responds to the opening up of Japan to the West. But I think in summary, the kind of Japanese tattooing that we know and love today is not that old, even though the imagery itself is, and certainly the folklore of it is very old indeed. But it's a visual cultural style that comes out of joy, it comes out of idleness, it comes out of artistic creativity, and it comes out of people on the margins of society and kids in a really genuine and loving way, trying to kind of rub mainstream society up the wrong way. And such as it always been.
Love it. So with that is the end of this episode. Like we said, we're going to take it up next week or next episode. Next week, we actually have a very, very special bonus episode. Matt, do you want to tell people what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, you are reading this book, The Tattoo Murder, which came out in Japan in 1848. It's by an author called Akimitsu Tagaki. It's kind of very, Agatha Christie style potboiler, kind of closed room mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be speaking to Pascal Bagot, a French journalist and author who discovered a few years ago Akamatsu Tagaki's archive. And as we'll talk about, if you read the book, you can see that Tagaki spent a lot of time around tattooed people. There's a lot of historical truth in the fiction. And Pascal discovered his archive of photographs which depict a particular kind of side of Japanese tattooing when it was really underground and really sort of socially taboo and illegal in the 1940s. He wrote a book a few years ago that's getting republished called The Tattoo Writer, with images from the book, which you can pre-order now on his website. And we're going to be chatting to him about this novel, about the things it talks about, and no spoilers, the historical context of it, Japanese tattooing in the 1940s, and his research into this really fascinating guy. So yeah,
cool. Well, if you want to hear that episode and other episodes like it, as well as hearing episodes like this early, make sure to check us out on Patreon for as little as £5 a month. You can get these free episodes early. You can get bonus episodes like the chat we're going to have with Pascal. You get to support the show. You get to see all the cool stuff that we're doing. And if you want to follow us online, you can find us at Beneath the Skin Pod. Also on the Patreon, if you subscribe at the £15 tier, you can get a signed copy of Matt's book, Painted People, The History of Tattooing in 21 People. Said it right?
More or less, that'll do.
So, like I said, you can find us online at Beneath the Skin Pod. You can find me at Goddard@Guineas. You can find Matt at Matt Lauder, pretty much everywhere. And yeah, thanks very much. Make sure to, if you enjoyed the show, to leave us a review. It helps with the algorithm. People find us. But until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.